This evening, we are happy to welcome Peter Lehner joining us from Earthjustice, which is the country's largest nonprofit public interest environmental law organization. And Peter is the managing attorney for their sustainable food and farming program. The SFF program deploys strategies to promote a more just, environmentally sound, and climate resilient agricultural system, and to reduce the health, environmental, and climate harms from the production of our food. Peter was the executive director of the Natural Resources Defense Council and the NRDC Action Fund, where he grew the organization, particularly the climate change and clean energy programs, and expanded the food system work. From 1999 to 2006, he served as the Chief Environmental Protection Bureau of the New York State Attorney General's Office, supervising all the environmental litigation by and against the state. And along with many other accomplishments, he also helps manage 2 family farms. Peter holds an AB in philosophy and mathematics from Harvard College and is an honors graduate of Columbia University Law School, where he now teaches a class on agricultural and environmental law. Welcome. Thank you so much for taking the time to join us this evening, and we can't wait to learn.
Thank you. And thank you for being here. I'm going to take you on a bit of a journey because I'm now focusing on agriculture, but other than being a voracious eater as a kid, I wasn't really focused on that much originally. So I started off in the environment really just because I like being outdoors. My first job actually after college was at the Sierra Club Legal Defense Fund, which was founded in 1970 to represent Sierra Club, and then started representing a whole bunch of different organizations, and so split off. In 1992, changed its name to Earthjustice, which is where I am now. So I've sort of come back to where I first started. But my first job after law school, I was working for the city of New York, the law department here. And it sounds like almost everybody here lives in the city. So one of the things that we discovered at that time was, well, first of all, I should say New York City is a great place environmentally. If you want to be an environmental lawyer, I mean, what do? We deal with problems, and New York City had a lot of environmental problems, so I had a really good job. But in terms of trying to keep the air clean, dealing with 50,000 tons of garbage a day, at that time I think New Yorkers drove 11 or 12 million miles a day in the city. The numbers are staggering, and that the city functions at all is sort of remarkable. But I'm going to come back to climate change. One of the areas that we started focusing on was the drinking water supply. You all know, I hope, that you have this fantastic drinking water system. It comes into the city by gravity and is largely protected by natural processes. But in the mid-1980s, the city started realizing we had to start thinking about the water supply. It started, as you probably all know, in a typhoid epidemic in 1840, and they started building reservoirs further and further away. And the last reservoirs finished in 1958, and it was so far away, no worries, it was clean. But development started expanding even in these areas, so the city started having to think about how do we keep our water clean? Because even back then, if we were going to filter it, we, the city, it was going to cost us $10 or $20 billion. Back when that was a lot of money. And we started a program to try to keep the water supply clean. And one of the things I discovered there is that the environmental laws gave me great tools as a lawyer for the city to go after industrial sources that were polluting the streams that fed into the reservoirs, that fed into the aqueduct, that fed into your glass of water. And the sewage treatment plants for the towns that were upstate, or even the septic systems and the housing that might have been failing. But the environmental laws actually did not do a great job with agriculture. And that was my very first awareness of how the agriculture is treated very differently than virtually everything else from an environmental perspective. So the law would, if there was a town, say with the sewage treatment plant that was treating its waste, the human waste, but not perfectly, representing the city, I could sue the town and get them to clean up their sewage treatment plant. But right next to that would be a farm with cows standing in the stream, and one dairy cow produces about as much waste every day as about 400 people. So it doesn't take too many cows standing in the stream, you know, it's not a pretty sight. And there was very little we could do. So at that time, I started becoming aware that we had environmental concerns, we had a special problem with agriculture. The other thing that I realized back then was beginning to think about climate change. I brought what is, I think, the first climate change lawsuit in 1988. So I've been fighting this battle for a very long time. At that time, we were suing President Reagan's National Highway Traffic and Safety Administration for rolling back fuel economy standards. Since then, I've sued President Bush for rolling back fuel economy standards, President Trump for rolling back fuel economy standards, and we're going to be doing it again. But this was President Reagan a long time ago. And what is really, I would say, both the amazing part, but sadly I think also sort of the heartbreaking part, is if we had really started taking climate change seriously in 1988, we already knew enough back then to realize we should take action. We would be in a very, very different place than we are now. But what was interesting in that case in 1988, we were suing the federal government that set the fuel economy standards, and of course GM and Ford intervened in the case. And at that time, nobody argued that climate change was not real. Everyone acknowledged that climate change was real. I mean, carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, it's warming the atmosphere, and it's having these impacts. And then, flash forward to say 2007, when we were arguing the US Supreme Court, a case known as Massachusetts versus EPA, which was whether EPA could regulate these greenhouse gases. At that time, everyone is saying, oh, climate change, we're not sure, the science is uncertain enough. And so what had happened? In 1988, the science was solid. And in 2007, it was less solid? No, what had happened in between was a massive campaign by the fossil fuel industry, essentially to lie, cheat, deceive the public about the uncertainty of climate change. But it really was an amazing thing, and I think back, wow, nobody disputed the science in 1988, but they're still disputing the science now in 2025. And that shows you, unfortunately, the power of disinformation that we have had to wrestle with. So anyhow, just going back to the city, we started a whole program to protect our water supply, and you'll be glad to know your water supply is still largely unfiltered and still very clean. I continued in this work. I later went to the state government and ran the Environmental Bureau for the state of New York, and again found that we brought a lot of climate change lawsuits. The first of the cases challenging power companies and for their harm they were causing. And now you've probably heard of the many cases out there where cities and states around the country are suing the oil industry for lying about climate change and trying to get recompense, trying to get damages. Well, we brought the first of those cases, the state of New York, in 2004. It went up to the Supreme Court, and for particular reasons, that one didn't, we won in the Second Circuit, the appellate level, but then lost in the Supreme Court. Not particularly a surprise given the Supreme Court, unfortunately. But at the state of New York, we again found that we had tools. The environmental laws gave us pretty good tools to deal with air and water pollution and even energy and climate pollution from power plants, from cars, from factories, from buildings, but very few tools to deal with agriculture. And so again and again, you see what's happened since 1970, when the Clean Air Act was passed, the Clean Water Act, most of our environmental laws were passed between about 1969 and 1973. Our air has actually gotten a lot cleaner. Many of us here in this room can probably remember when the air in New York was not very clean. The water has gotten cleaner. I swim in the Hudson River, and I wouldn't have done that 50 years ago. But our food system has actually gotten dirtier. So a few years ago, well, now about 10 or 15 years ago, I realized I wanted to start focusing on the food system, because this was an element that was driving environmental challenges that, by and large, the environmental community wasn't dealing with. So the first thing I did was to try to learn about it, because I'd spent my life suing power plants and factories and dealing with transportation systems and nuclear waste sites or whatever else. And I found that there was surprisingly little information about particularly the climate impact of our food system. And there was either no information, or wrong information, or information that was very heavily tilted one way or the other. One way is sort of conventional ag saying nothing can be done, this is just perfect, and other types of agriculture saying if you do it this way, we're going to solve the entire planet's problems. And it was just all over the place. So because I also teach at law school and therefore I'm sort of nerdy and wonky and take notes and all, I ended up trying to learn a lot. I ended up writing a chapter of a big book that focused on agriculture and climate change. It ended up being the biggest chapter of the book because the other chapters were very small on things like rooftop solar, and I had all of agriculture. So I ended up expanding that. They asked me to make it into a book, and I wrote this book, which you can get if you want to read more about this, which is The Science, Law, and Policy of Climate Neutral Agriculture. And what I found was that, first of all, agriculture contributes a lot more to climate change than most people realize. The food system drives about as much climate change as our transportation system. About a third of climate change is from the food system. And if we don't address our food system, and in terms of its climate impact, even if we are really lucky and decarbonize our energy system and decarbonize our transportation system and decarbonize our buildings, we fry. The agriculture system alone will get us past 1.5 or 2 degrees centigrade. By the way, it seems to me we're in the United States, for better or for worse, and we use Fahrenheit here. So when we speak of 1.5 degrees centigrade, which means nothing to most people, it seems we should talk about 3 or 4 degrees Fahrenheit, and then we should realize that that's a global temperature, and actually the global average temperature, because the oceans are so big and they move more slowly, 4 degrees in the planet means about 8 degrees Fahrenheit on land. So this target we're aiming for, which sounds like 1.5 degrees, that's not very much. It's actually 8 degrees Fahrenheit on land. And that is a lot. And that is what we're very likely going to be blowing past very shortly. So the first thing again is we have to deal with agriculture, because if we don't, we're not going to avoid catastrophic and cataclysmic climate change. And then the question is, so how do we deal with it? Since the standard laws don't apply, and actually then realizing it's also very different. Where does agriculture contribute to climate change? So when you think of climate change, what do you think of? You think of burning fossil fuels, right? Yeah, that's what everybody thinks of. There's some fossil fuels burning in agriculture: tractors, ventilation fans, irrigation pumps, and all the rest of that, and in processing the food and manufacturing fertilizer. But actually, and you can remember it, it's cows, corn, and crap that causes the agricultural impact. Cows belch methane. The largest source of methane is not the oil and gas system, it's cows belch it. Their stomachs are different than yours and mine, so they can eat grass that you and I can't eat. But when they exhale, it's 95% methane. When you and I exhale, it may have a tiny trace of methane, but not, depending on the day maybe, but not very much. Cows also, and chickens and pigs, and by the way, just to take a guess, how many animals do you think are slaughtered every minute for our food system?
No idea, because I don't eat
Anyone-
animals.
Anyone wanna guess?
2 million.
How many?
2 million.
2 million, that's a
You
every
got
minute.
chickens. You
That
don't
would
get
be
meat out of
a
one
lot.
chicken.
So the number is 18,000 animals are slaughtered every minute, for a food supply.
You said per day though,
I'm sorry?
right? You said per
Every
day.
minute.
No, I said, I think I said per minute, but I could have said per day.
Wow.
In any
That includes
event,
sardines.
so then think about that, those 18,000 animals had a whole life beforehand, and they created a lot of poop. And unlike human waste, which is treated in sewage treatment plants, et cetera, it's largely just dumped on the ground, or in big pits and then dumped on the ground. And all of that manure and that animal waste sits there and releases methane. And it also releases nitrous oxide, which is a potent greenhouse gas, about 300 times worse than carbon dioxide. And then we have fertilizer, all of that corn, hundreds of millions of acres, about 90 million acres of corn, 90 million acres of soybean, a couple 100 million acres of other things, have tons of fertilizer dumped on them, about twice as much actually as the crops actually use. And that excess fertilizer doesn't just vanish, it goes somewhere. Some of it runs off in the water, causing water pollution. You've heard of harmful algae outbreaks, the dead zone in the Gulf of Mexico. And a lot of it goes into the atmosphere as nitrous oxide. So when you put all of that together, agriculture's contribution to climate change is enormous. And then you add to that the fact that agriculture is on land and uses most of our land. Agriculture, if you think of whenever you go somewhere, what do you see? You see the land mostly has been changed by agriculture. You know, there's some cities and factories, et cetera, but it's mostly agriculture, 60% in fact. And when land is converted from a forest or a grassland to agriculture, all the carbon that is stored in that soil is released. Agricultural soils are virtually dead for the most part. So you've got cows, corn, and crap that create this tremendous impact, and if we don't deal with it, we're in trouble. So then the question is, okay, can we deal with it? What can we do? And the answer to some extent is, now I'm going to give you a visual here, or I thought I was going to. It went to sleep. How do I wake it up? Wake up.
Might take a couple of minutes.
Um,
Yeah, no, it's only one slide.
Is the light on? No, this light turned up.
Might have to get it now.
That sounds better.
Sounds good.
There we go.
Here we go. So this is what I was just talking about. This is the impact of agriculture. It's the land conversion, releasing all the carbon. It's the food, the nitrous oxide, and the animals, the cows, the corn, and the crap, and then the processing, because we don't eat food right off the field for the most part. So what do we do to try to reduce that, to get that down to a level that doesn't lead to catastrophic climate change? Roughly speaking, there's some steps we can do. One way is we can try to farm better. Right now, we farm, by and large, terribly. And there are a lot of things that can be done. That's part of what I talk about in the book. Practices that, say, rotating crops and disturbing the soil less and keeping the land covered over the winter. All of that can make a big difference. And the good thing is we know that that works because farmers have undertaken many of these practices on their own and implemented them. We can then know that they have a great climate impact. They also protect water quality and habitat. They can also be very profitable. The challenge is they're used on about 2% of American cropland. So we have to convert that 2% to 92%, and that's not going to happen without policy change. Another thing we can do is trees, add trees to pasture land. Right now, most pasture land is just empty, and yet it can serve just as well as pasture land with trees in it. And in fact, as the weather gets hotter, cows and particularly like some shade. Many crops are also doing better with some shade. And adding trees to agricultural land is one of the most powerful tools we have. We can also try to make our food a little more efficient. And if we grow more food on the same amount of land, we can slow deforestation. Because right now, deforestation is another, around the world, we've already deforested it mostly here, but it's a worldwide market for food. You probably know that we import 20% of our food, and much of that comes from countries where there's active deforestation going on right now. So if we can stop the deforestation, we can make a big, big difference. So add the trees where there aren't any, and stop cutting down the trees. And you're perfectly right to be a tree hugger in this area. Trees are, you probably had heard in other areas a lot about direct air capture and carbon removal techniques. By far the most efficient thing we can do now is not cut down the trees and plant a lot more trees in agricultural land. Then there's a big chunk we can do in terms of what we do with our food. That's all how we grow, and to some extent where we grow. Let's not grow our food in areas that we need to cut down the forest for. Then the question is, what do we do with our food? And what do we do with what we produce? Right now, as you probably know, we waste about 30 or 40% of the food that we produce. And that's a colossally idiotic thing. Not only does it cost the average family about $2,000 a year, it is also a tremendous waste of resources of every sort. So we can reduce the amount of food that we produce that is just thrown away. Most of that, by the way, thrown away is dumped in a landfill where it rots and produces more methane. We also have an area about the size of Indiana and Illinois together producing fuel, biofuels. You can see if you drive around, you go to a gas station and it says 10% ethanol. That ethanol is there because of a law requiring refiners to add ethanol, mostly made from corn, to their fuel. They don't particularly like it, but they have to do it. And now they're beginning to add a lot more diesel oil made from soybeans. And you may start hearing about sustainable aviation fuel, also made from ethanol or soy diesel, which will also be, unfortunately, something that sounds good, but is actually very bad from a climactic perspective. And then, because we do use some energy in processing, how you convert from the crop to what is on your plate, we can be a lot more energy efficient there. One of the most remarkable things, though, is that we can't get there to a climate-friendly food system without dietary change. About 60 or 70% of all the impact of our food system is from meat. And almost all of that is beef. Much, much more than pork or chicken or fish, and vastly more than plants. And so cutting down on the particularly American very, very heavy meat diet is not only a very powerful tool, it is necessary. And whether people shift from eating meat to eating plants, to eating plant-based burgers, to eating cultivated meat, whatever, there's lots of alternatives. But as we grow it now, beef is a profoundly climate unfriendly food. Challenge is it's also politically, as it were, a hot potato. And the minute you talk about that, fireworks start going off. But that's the sort of the scientific reality. Oh, and then the last step, well, we don't know. How do we actually get to climate neutral agriculture at the scale that we need to? There's some promising ideas out there, whether we can add biochar to lands, whether or not some of the new techniques to give vaccines to cows that will make them belch less methane. There's a lot out there that could be helpful. Unfortunately, agricultural research was going down even before President Trump, and of course is being slashed now. So that question mark may be a little harder to get to, but we have to work very hard at it. So that is all what we can do societally, and some people have said, what do I do personally? Well, one is nobody knows about this, so talk about it. The fact that agriculture does, and our food system does have this enormous impact on climate change is a really critical issue. You can make food choices. How often do you buy a new car? Not very often. You make food choices every day. And those food choices resonate. It's not only what the food you're getting at that moment, but that sends a message through the market that is extremely important. I analogize it to the more you bike, the more pressure there is for bike lanes. And it's the same thing in terms of your food choices. And making sure that food is part of the climate conversation. Now it's interesting that in 2018, the last farm bill that passed Congress, there was no mention of climate change. Indeed, when we were lobbying on that, if we mentioned climate change at all, we were told by our ally, don't mention it because it's going to cost you. So the 2018 Farm Bill really did nothing to help farmers adopt these more sustainable practices that might help reduce climate change. We pushed very, very hard, and in the Inflation Reduction Act that President Biden and the Democrats passed, you probably know about a lot of the clean energy provisions that got a lot of the attention, but there was $20 billion in that to help farmers adopt climate-friendly farming practices. And that was the first time Congress ever put climate change and agriculture into the same sentence. So it was really an important, really a watershed moment in terms of public policy. Unfortunately, the new administration isn't so enthusiastic about that. One of the early efforts they did was to try to purge the U.S. Department of Agriculture's websites of anything relating to climate change. Any reference to the word climate change or even extreme weather was taken off the websites. So we sued them on behalf of some farmers and others, and fortunately, I guess 2 weeks ago maybe, the government essentially folded and is putting all the information back up, which is really critical because many farmers, particularly more conventional farmers, they're beginning to see this extreme weather stuff is real, and maybe I don't believe in climate change, but I sure as heck know the weather is changing and weather patterns are changing and extreme weather is getting worse, and what do I do about it? And under the Inflation Reduction Act, there was opportunity to get technical and financial assistance to do something about it, and that was all being taken away. In addition to taking the information off the websites, the administration has frozen a lot of the money or terminated a lot of the grants under a program called Partnership for Climate Smart Commodities. So we've also sued the administration over those freezing and terminating those contracts. Those cases are still going on, although some of the government has reversed course even before the court has issued an order and is beginning to release some of the money. But I'm sure you've all read about all the money that the government is freezing across the board. So as they freeze, we litigate, and the dance goes on, I suppose. So that's where we are today, and happy to take any questions. Yeah.
Wow. About 2 years ago, I became part of a group that was studying possible ag law, and we couldn't find anybody in Congress who wanted to pass a law like that. We couldn't, maybe we were wrong. So by some strange, wonderful miracle, there is a current member of Congress called Adriano Espaillat, and he actually filed a bill. 1/3 of it is changing the big agro businesses to adopt regenerative agriculture. I am an ethical person. It bothers me that we have no proof that this would ever work. And in the bill, it says that the big agro businesses will be given a choice to start some sustainable agriculture on their land and have a reduction in their taxes. And if they don't wanna do it, they get some kind of penalty. This, I have never seen data as to whether this ever will work. And I came here tonight, kind of a little banged up, but I came here to listen to you. And this is the first time I've located a bona fide expert. I'm going to give you my business card, and I hope you can at least get me to what went into the Infrastructure Act of Biden, and realize that you're not my private lawyer, but to hook me up with somebody who could help me postulate, would these big agro giants ever go for this bill?
No.
That's what I'm afraid of.
So-
Please, this is only for this group, because it's very disloyal to me for, Espaillat having done all of this.
Well, Rachel,
If there's no way.
Rachel,
Yes.
So-
so let's see what he.
So
let
a
him-
couple thoughts. One is when I was revising the chapter and expanding it into the book, we added a new chapter in this focusing on what we thought called the stakeholders in farm policy.
Okay.
Right now, the Farm Bill, which is started in the Depression when farms were struggling and people were hungry, and those sort of started feeding programs and farm support programs that have continued to this day. That comes around about every 5 years. Of course, now it's supposed to have been reauthorized in 2023. It's not been happening yet. By and large, the people who are loud and who have influence is industrial agriculture. And yet, actually, our food comes from a very small number of facilities. There, in theory, are 2 million farms in the country. Now, again, we have this heritage of half of America were farmers. But right now, fewer than 2% of Americans are in farming. And there's about 2 million farms. Of those farms, well over half are hobby farms, tax farms, or whatever people have because they want a tax break on their land, they like, moving lawn ornaments or whatever. And it produces very little of our food. 90% of our food comes from 6% of our farms. And you've got this incredible concentration. 4 companies control 85% of our beef. And they also control the political dialogue. But all of us eat. And almost everybody is downwind or downstream of farms and are having to deal with farm pollution. And all of us are affected by, for example, antibiotic overuse, which creates antibiotic resistance and kills 35,000 Americans every year. We're all affected by that. And those people are largely left out. And so until we can all bring all of these stakeholders in, none of these bills have a chance. Representative Shelley Pingree is an organic farmer from Maine. She's introduced the Agricultural Resilience Act, a great bill. If I were emperor, it would be great to have this. It would encourage all sorts of this stuff. And it doesn't have a chance unless we change the political dynamic and bring in a lot of other voices. Senator Cory Booker from New Jersey has introduced a couple terrific bills. And again, unless we change the political power structure, we're not going to have a chance to get there. And that's why I think it's important to talk about this, because you were all speaking earlier as you introduced yourself, concerned about climate change, and that's great, and keep going. But how often have any of you really started advocating on the food system, or thought about, we have to participate not just in clean energy debates, but in the Farm Bill? What the hell is the Farm Bill? And until all of these groups start paying attention to the Farm Bill and farm policy, we're getting nowhere. So, thank you all for being here for this.
Great, thank you. Any other questions? Yes.
Yeah.
Well, I have two questions. One is about the food system and one is a kind of meta question about process and legislation as a means of environmental progress and the abundance agenda. I'm dying to get your take on this. But first let me begin with a question about the food system. So sometimes more techno-optimist climate advocates will say that we must suppress organic farming because it's actually more carbon intensive than industrial agriculture, and I don't really understand how to parse those debates, so I'd love to hear what you say about them. And then again, my larger question is sort of your take on the abundance agenda and turning people like you into the villains of our climate story.
So, as to the first, I think the challenge is looking at it just as, oh, should we do everything like we're doing now, except do it organic? And that's just a stupid question, so it's gonna lead to stupid answers.
Okay.
The answer is we have a food system that has many, many different elements to it. Take the simple one. We waste 30% of our food. Now, if we didn't waste 30% of our food, but we were organic producing that might be 20% less efficient, we'd still be better off. If we didn't have such a meat-heavy diet, we could have plenty of room to grow or have biofuels, 50 million acres of biofuels. That, by the way, 50 million acres of biofuels. You could get the same energy to move cars around with 200,000 acres of solar panels. That would leave you 49.8 million acres left over for, reforestation and sequestering carbon. So it's just to isolate one issue like that is crazy and leads to, as I said, dumb answers. You also have the reality that very little research has been done in organic farming. What has been done has sort of been a few good people here and there, the Rodale Institute, a few organic farmers, but 95+% of our research has been in conventional farming. So yeah, the yields are a little better there. If we actually started putting research into more sustainable methods, organic being one but not the only, almost certainly the yields would increase dramatically, as they always do whenever attention is paid. So you're taking a snapshot at organic that has been under-researched, under-resourced, under-practiced, and comparing it to something else. And then the last is we need to think, yes, in terms of, if you just think in terms of yield, but yield of what? Right now, we tend to think yield of how many bushels of corn. Much of that is converted into crap. We're not actually thinking about yield in terms of nutrition. Food is supposed to actually nourish us. And as the epidemics of many long-term chronic diseases, whether it be cardiovascular disease, diabetes, obesity, and many, many others show, our food system isn't doing that. So again, I think you're being trolled basically when somebody says, oh, if we go organic, then it's going to use more. That's sort of, that premise is wrong. Your second question on the abundance agenda, I think it's easy to portray the environmental community as having been very good at stopping things. And to some extent, that is right. I think we have to acknowledge that we've stopped a lot. And in retrospect, some of that wasn't necessarily the right thing to stop. And we haven't always put enough effort in, for example, building out the clean energy economy. It's one thing I've closed a lot of coal-fired power plants in my life through litigation. But if I just close power plants and put people out of work and reduce the tax base in small towns and shut off energy supplies, that isn't gonna be a long-term strategy, because in the end, people need jobs, people need tax base, and people need energy. So it's not wrong to say that we should be focusing on making sure that we can build out the clean energy. And what's happened now, of course, is clean energy is cheaper than dirty energy, and it is beginning to snowball and get moving, which is why the fossil fuel industry is terrified, and the House Reconciliation Bill would kill all of that. So I guess what I'm saying is, in terms of, there's some truth, I think, in the abundance agenda, saying that we should think about the forward process, not just the backwards. And in the food system, when we talk about diet, often people think, oh, getting rid of meat, that's terrible. Well, how about eating healthy? Sleeping better, not having chronic diseases. And instead of thinking it as a backwards agenda, forgoing something, thinking of it as a forward agenda. In terms of many of these things, it's an opportunity to have clean water and a food system, as opposed to one or the other. So a lot of it is, I think, in the framing of it. Yeah.
Thank you. So I hear a lot of things in your whole presentation. My great concern is first of all, the policies that are being put forth, the bills, they are not based on what people necessarily think are going to pass, but the hope of what is necessary. Is that correct?
I mean, some bills are what are called marker bills, which essentially, like Shelley Pingree's Agricultural Resilience Act, it would be a great bill, and so it's sort of a marker of aspiration.
Mm-hmm.
And then in political reality, when we're down in Washington lobbying, at least before this current Congress, we would push certain pieces of it that we think could pass.
But it's not
So there's a
intentionally
mixture
disingenuous.
of aspiration and reality.
Not intentionally disingenuous though, of them to
No,
to do. Okay.
no.
So that's good. That's good news. So if the climate is changing, we know it's changing, we accept the science, we wanna change our diet, but the sun is killing the crops. What else is being done to ensure that even if we take those steps, that the farmers are fully aware of how to grow their crops? I know you mentioned trees, shade, that would protect somewhat maybe the crops, but what types of trees, by the way?
Yeah, varies tremendously, whether you're in the northeast or the southeast or the desert southwest, different tree crops, different perennial crops. And that is exactly, though, I think your question is what's helping the farmers figure out what to do. And that is the technical assistance that is so important, that the U.S. Department of Agriculture used to have people in every county in the country. Unfortunately, under Trump, they just fired 16,000 staff. Most of those were technical experts in the field providing support to farmers. Because say you're a farmer and you inherited your land and you're growing corn, and you start to think, hey, this climate change stuff is real and I'm concerned about it, but I don't know anything. I just grown corn. My father just grew corn. I don't know what to do. Where do you go? The fertilizer company will tell you to just keep growing corn and put more fertilizer on. So, and you need some help to figure out. Even if you want to do it, you're willing to take the financial risk, etc. You need some technical help. So the government used to do that a lot, and there was $300 million in the Inflation Reduction Act in top of all the other money, just to provide more people to help farmers. And that is all being taken away, and so we're continuing to fight for that. But you're right, farmers need the help to figure out what to do.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah.
Do the states, does New York do anything like that? Does New
Say
York
again?
have any funding for anything like that?
They do, a couple, 5 years ago maybe, we got the Climate Resilient Farming Bill passed, and so now there's a Climate Resilient Farming Fund that gets about $5–10 million a year. Do you wanna say something on that?
No, I wanna ask a different question.
Oh, okay.
Just want to.
And so New York provides some funds and some technical assistance for that. New York also has what's called the Agricultural Non-Point Source Pollution Program, which is a fancy term for agricultural water pollution prevention. And because many of the practices that are good from a climate perspective are also good for protecting water quality, and that fund provides on the order of $15 million a year to New York farmers. And then every county in New York, other than New York City counties, have soil and water conservation districts, which provide some technical assistance. So short answer is yes, but not nearly at the scale that the federal government. So the federal government's freeze of funds has been a real hit.
Is there discussion of this whole focus, anybody focusing on adding money to, I mean, I know the budget just got resolved, not favorably.
The most recent budget wasn't bad. I mean, we're in a, look, New York is in a tight squeeze. We're gonna get a lot less federal money, and we're having to fight for a lot of things that, in my view, we shouldn't have to fight so hard for. But the most recent budget on these types of core environmental issues was pretty much a hold steady, which was pretty good as the states go.
My question has to do with China. Is there any?
China.
China, the
Okay.
country. Yeah. So can we learn from what they are doing? I mean, they have a very limited agriculture area, and they have tremendous innovation in farming, agriculture, and they're very climate aware. They're years ahead of we are in every other field. So we have to assume that they're working in these areas.
When I was running NRDC, another big environmental group, we had about 40 people in China, so I went to China every year. And every time I would fly over and think, what am I doing? This is a waste of time. I mean, what can one little group do to affect China? Because of their different governmental structure, if they want to do something,
They do it.
they can do it. Not necessarily as well as it sometimes seems, but they can get it done. And so if we could advise the government and encourage them, you don't sue the Chinese government the way we do here, but in a friendly sort of way, advise them, there can be a big difference.
But do you think
Their-
they're ahead of us?
Their agriculture is, I think it's a mix. In some ways, they're way behind us, and in some industrialized way, they're ahead of us. I mean, most of our animals are produced in what are called concentrated animal feeding operations, or CAFOs, which are basically factories, where the animals are kept in an area this size. You'd have several thousand chickens or several hundred pigs. And these are ginormous. Some of these will have 50,000 cows or 2 million chickens. If we think those are big, in China they now have high-rise animal factories. In addition to, and I guess you could say the better part of that, it's all in a building, and so they can actually catch some of the methane that the animals exhale, and they all the waste comes to a sewage treatment plant. And if you don't think about what I would argue, the immorality of treating sentient animals like that, there's arguably some efficiencies there. So I think in short, on the food system, the main thing that China has in terms of, if you were to look at the footprint, is they eat a lot less meat, although that is rapidly increasing as they've gotten richer around the world. As countries get richer, they eat more meat, and so their sort of food carbon footprint gets much worse. So a long answer to say, we generally are not looking to China for many examples.
Well, who are you? And what about European?
Europe has in many ways has been better in terms of they banned a lot more toxic chemicals and nasty pesticides than we have, so that is arguably better. Their they also heavily subsidize agriculture as we do, but we subsidize agriculture in a way that makes the big farms bigger and drives the small farms out of business, which is why rural America is sort of devastated and empty. In Europe, they subsidize also very heavily, but much more supportive of small farms. And that has had, I would say, more of a cultural difference in terms of the vibrance of rural communities as opposed to in the US. But again, part of it that is complicated is, and why thinking about food systems is very different than energy, is we're talking biology, we're talking animals, we're talking much more complicated systems. If you have a power plant that burns coal, I can tell you exactly the pollution from that power plant. I have literally litigated cases whether the power plant would reduce their sulfur dioxide emissions 94% or 96%. You can't even conceive of that level of precision with an animal, or with trying to say application of fertilizer and reducing nitrous oxide. And there's all these trade-offs. You're dealing with living things, if you care, and many people do, but you're dealing with their biological system. So reducing methane, you can't talk about it as reduce 18% versus 20% or whatever. Biology just doesn't lend itself to that level of precision. So that's why you have to think often more holistically, and why I think it's, I don't want to take one piece of this out. If you want to transform the food system, you have to do all of it. And so in terms of a model, there'll be pieces of Europe or pieces here and there that are interesting, but sadly there are not many countries, really none that we can think of, that overall have a food system where we want to go.
We have time for one last question, and that's it. Lena, I'm gonna defer to you. We have to
So
wrap it
many
up.
questions.
Yeah,
You
we
could
have to
keep you
wrap it
here for all night. Couple of things quickly. I remember in the South, in Oklahoma, this was years ago, all of the lakes and bodies of water had been basically ruined by chicken farmers. And Purdue, I believe, was the company, but what they contracted out was individual chicken farmers. And so Purdue had no responsibility for the waste stream. It was up to the little farmer to deal with their waste. So that's why everything just, went crazy, and there was no regulations also. So I don't know if that's like a typical business model that you're, having to deal with.
Yes,
That's
it
one question.
is. And that really changed in the 70s and 80s, and it was started really by Tyson.
Oh, Tyson was the one.
That started, and they took a model actually in some ways from the oil companies. You may recall, some of us may be old enough to recall, gas stations were owned by the oil majors, the Esso station or the Texaco station or whatever. And then what the oil companies realized is those gas stations are actually real problems. They have underground storage tanks where the gas is kept, and it leaks into the groundwater and harms drinking water. And so those things are just a pain in the, they're a liability.
Mm-hmm.
And so they divested themselves of a lot of the gas stations, but through franchise agreements kept very tight control of them. But then when it turns out that these gas stations were causing pollution, those gas stations were owned by, an elderly couple thinking that they were gonna retire on it. And when I was at the state of New York, we had a whole program going after leaking underground storage tanks, LUST, the LUST program, which, interestingly named. But, and the challenge was that many of them, even though you knew it was Exxon or Mobil or whoever, Shell getting all the real control, it was actually just owned by people who had no resources. So that was done by the oil companies very strategically. And the meat companies have done the same thing. They take the worst part and the riskiest part of the production, which is basically from baby animal to just before slaughter, And they give that to somebody else under very, very strict conditions, under a very tight contract. And then they take it back at the end. So they'll give you like the baby chick, and they'll take the chicken just before slaughter, but all in between, the risk of the animals getting sick, all the poop they produce, is somebody else's
No
problem.
responsibility.
And so one of the challenges has been to hold the Tysons, the JBSs, the Purdue's liable for the pollution of these contract farmers. And that was, I mentioned Cory Booker's bill, that would be one part of Cory Booker's bill, to hold them accountable for the pollution caused by their contract farmers.
Okay.
But that is a very strategic move to distance themselves from the problem.
Right, yeah. So, the other question is, thank you, just as far as we go, do you have any examples of activist campaigns that have targeted some of the stakeholders in the agricultural sector, like in conjunction with a lawsuit that you're working on, like a way that we could support something that's already underway to bring some public pressure and attention and education to the problem?
Yeah, so one of the challenges we have here is, as I've said, is nobody really knows about this, and agricultural operations are exempt even from reporting most of their pollution. If you're a factory, you have to at a minimum report your water pollution and your air pollution and your hazardous pollution. If you're an animal factory, you don't have to. And into that vacuum of information, the companies can jump in and lie. And so we've brought some greenwashing cases where, for example, JBS, the world's largest beef company, the US's largest beef company, was saying they're going to be net zero by 2040, and which is virtually a physical impossibility, as well as the fact they weren't doing anything close to what they would have had to do to start moving in that direction. But they're greenwashing. They're lying to their consumers and trying to tell the consumer, you may have heard that beef isn't so good for the climate, but don't worry, we're going to be net zero by 2040, so have your steak with a clean conscience. It's a lie, but it makes people feel good. So we sued them in front of an industry board, actually, not in court, but in front of an industry advertising self-regulatory body. And we won, and we went to appeal, and we won again. But JBS continued to lie about this, so now the New York Attorney General has sued them for the same lying. We also brought a similar case against Tyson, who was making similar claims. They were going to be net zero by 2050, but also not doing nearly enough. And so there have been some consumer campaigns led by Mighty Earth, Friends of the Earth, and a few of the other organizations, and 350 may have been involved. I know I've seen their name on some of the petitions and other letters that have been trying to put pressure on the big meat companies, really focused on their lying at this point. And Earthjustice, we're largely a litigating group, so we represent groups. We represent 350 in a lot of litigations. We represent Sierra Club and other groups. So we mostly focus on litigation, so I have not been personally involved. I've advised a bit on the legal aspects of those campaigns. But they're definitely out there, campaigns on the big meat companies, and that's probably your best opportunity.
Right. And meanwhile, if anything comes up locally
Let us know.
that you're working on, let us know if we can be of support, in that kind of a way. Before, I hate to let you go before Jane, who's heads our composting working group, if you had any questions for him, just since it's so related.
Well, I'm going to jump in and say I live on the Upper East Side, and we just got composting there in our building like a month ago, and it's great. Finally, it's not that hard. So that's one of the things that obviously you can do for food waste. Ideally, have less food waste, but at a minimum, compost it instead of dump it in the garbage.
And you have no idea what went into it to make that.
Oh, I do.
actually
I do
happen.
know what went into it. I can promise you I do.
Yeah. I mean, anything in particular, Jane, because we're running a little bit late.
Yeah,
Specific.
But I know this gentleman wanted to ask a question.
Well, we're gonna have.
I can stick
wrap it
around
up.
afterwards if you
Okay.
wanna ask some questions.
We have
Happy
to vacate the room by
Oh.
8:30, we only have the room till 8:30, so apologies.
I have a question for any vegetarians after we're done.
Okay, well, but I apologize, but we have the room from 6:30 to 8:30, and we're the only group in the building tonight, so they need to take down the room and clean up. Apologies, this was amazing presentation, really just, and this could be a part one of 2 parts. I mean,
Yes.
there's a lot to process.
If you wanna know more, you can get this, I hate to say it, on Amazon, but I think also on a bookstore or directly from Environmental Law Institute, the publisher. This is your copy, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
I forgot to bring mine. I would have brought a couple other copies, but I forgot.
Thank you so much, Peter. Thank you. Again, sorry to end abruptly, but just 2 things before we leave. These books over here are free if anybody's interested. The books on the back are my books, but you can just take a picture if there's something that you're interested in.